We begin in the Middle East and what could be the most significant visit yet to the region by Washington's top diplomat. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has arrived in Tel Aviv. It is his 9th trip to the region since the Israel-Hamas war began over 10 months ago. Now, Blinken is pushing for a new ceasefire and hostage deal, hoping that an agreement will also de-escalate tensions and prevent a wider conflict involving Iran and its proxies, who include Hamas. Now, ahead of his discussions with Blinken tomorrow, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has lashed out at Hamas at the latest meeting of his cabinet.
ולכן את הלחץ צריך להפנות לחמאס ולסינואר ולא לממשלת ישראל.
Netanyahu called Hamas obstinate, calling out the militant group for not sending a representative to last week's ceasefire talks in Qatar. He said any international pressure for a truce should be directed at the leadership of Hamas and not Israel. But meanwhile, in Gaza, we continue to see all too familiar scenes like this. People here are mourning the loss of a mother and her 6 children. They were killed in their home during an apparent Israeli airstrike in central Gaza. Israel has stepped up its offensive there and in neighboring Khan Yunis, claiming that militants have been firing rockets from these areas. Gaza officials say more than 24 Palestinians have been killed in fighting today. Journalist Iris Mackler is tracking the developments for us from Jerusalem. Iris, set up what Antony Blinken will be doing while in Israel and what he's hoping to achieve.
Antony Blinken will be meeting from tomorrow morning, one day here, the next day in Egypt, and in his day here in Jerusalem, he'll be meeting with the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister, and Israel's President. And front and center, in fact, I would say almost solely, is getting a ceasefire deal across the line. It's very important to Washington. It's very important to President Biden. It's important because of the situation in Gaza. We are now told that the death toll is over 40,000 people. Doesn't matter what percentage of those are combatants. It's a large number. This war has gone on for longer than anyone expected. The humanitarian situation, it is known, upsets President Biden, and now the health situation with the suggestion of possible illnesses spreading like polio. So there's that aspect. There's the fact that he really does care about the hostages. Some of those hostages are American Israelis. They have dual citizenship. Very important to him to get them out. If you look more broadly, he sees the threat of a regional war and the fact that it is already been diffused by these talks. You can see that. There's been 2 anticipated attacks, retaliatory attacks, for one from Tehran and one from Beirut. And both the leadership there, Hezbollah and the Iranian leadership, have held off while these talks are being held. So for all of those reasons, and of course, Natasha, personal politics, or at least Washington politics, they also care. They want this story, I think, off the table for the American elections by November. So for all those reasons, geopolitical, political US, political Middle East, they want this solved, and they want it solved this week.
Well, talking about this week, Blinken is then going to be heading to Egypt on Tuesday. Cairo is going to be the next venue for more ceasefire talks following last week's negotiations in Qatar. So tell us about those negotiations, especially given that Hamas is not taking part, or certainly didn't in Doha.
You know, it didn't take part in Doha. I don't see that from the analysts that I've spoken to as significant, as necessarily crucial, or something that would kill this deal, because the man who makes the decisions remains in Gaza, or rather beneath Gaza. Yahya Sinwar is the man who makes the decisions. The Hamas people were in Qatar. They just weren't at the talks. All the information was relayed to them. It really is he who decides. That's one thing. I tell you what does worry me and the analysts I've interviewed more, and that's the fact that you're hearing quite a bit of trash talking of these talks, of the success of their possibilities, both from Hamas and from certain right-wing Israeli politicians. And I think that's the thing that's more worrying. Fighting right up until the deadline is something we've seen in previous conflicts. And, you know, a difficulty in negotiations is something we've seen in previous conflicts too. But this kind of standing by the sidelines and explaining why the talks are doomed to fail is something we haven't seen, and that is very worrying, despite all the international pressure for success, and pressure from the ground too, from the people of Gaza, from the people of Israel, from the displaced in the south of Lebanon and the displaced in the north of Israel.
Journalist Iris Mackler in Jerusalem, thank you. So for more on this story, we have now reached Gershon Baskin. He's a hostage negotiator and Middle East director for the International Communities Organization. He's joining us from Jerusalem. Mr. Baskin, very good to have you back on the show, sir.
Thank you.
I want to get to Blinken's visit with you, but not until after we discuss this very innovative piece you've written for the Times of Israel. I was really surprised by it, but surprised in a way that I haven't heard anyone talk like this before. So essentially, the title of your piece is Bring the Hostages Home and Ending the War in 6 Weeks. And you've laid out a plan to do that. But before you make public the plan, you say if you were one of the peace negotiators or ceasefire negotiators right now under these circumstances, you would tender your resignation. Why is that, sir?
Well, because what we know is that the Israeli negotiators, the head of the Israeli Mossad, the head of the Israeli Shin Bet, and a retired general who's been brought in to coordinate these talks, have all differed with Prime Minister Netanyahu, believing that the deal that's on the table can be accepted by Israel, that the Israeli military intelligence and national security apparatus can deal with the consequences of the deal. Yet Mr. Netanyahu has put additional conditions and red lines on the table, which makes closing the gaps between Israel and Hamas almost impossible. That's where we stand right now, even though the Americans, the Qataris, and the Egyptians have put some bridging proposals on the table. My own understanding is that the deal that's on the table is not a good deal. It's not a good deal for Israel, and it will probably be rejected by Hamas as well. And the major thing that we need to achieve from the Israeli side is the release of all the 115 hostages, those alive and those who are not alive. But the deal that's currently on the table is talking about only 33 hostages in the first 6 weeks, and then continued negotiations for the rest of them. The hostages don't have another 6 weeks or 2 months or 3 months. They've been there for 10 and a half months already. It's believed that perhaps a majority of them are already dead, and this deal needs to get done. In addition, how many more people do we need to kill in Gaza? How much more destruction needs to be done in Gaza? There needs to be a political plan, not a military plan, for dealing with the future of the Palestinian nation, not only in Gaza, but the West Bank and East Jerusalem as well. And of course, there needs to be some kind of plan that's going to enable the 2.2 million people who live in Gaza to live. They're our neighbors. There are 7 million Palestinians and 7 million Israeli Jews living on this small land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, and we need to be thinking about that.
Well, you've been thinking about it, and you've got this plan that you've laid out in your piece. Talk to us. How would we get to a ceasefire? How would you bring this war to a conclusion in 6 weeks?
Right. I think it's not going to happen unless the United States, the Qataris, and the Egyptians use what I've called their doomsday leverage. The doomsday leverage of the United States on Israel is twofold. One is the veto in the Security Council that the Americans provide for Israel over many, many years. And the second is to say to Israel, listen, we have your back if you're attacked by Lebanon or if you're attacked by Iran, but we are not going to fuel the war in Gaza anymore. We want this war to end. As your reporter just said prior to this, I think that the United States does want the war to end. I think that the Biden administration wants to remove this issue from the campaign agenda of Kamala Harris. And for the sake of America maintaining its relationship with the rest of the Arab world, the war has to come to an end. So I think they need to use the doomsday leverage. The Egyptians hold the lifeline of the Gaza Strip in their hands, and they can apply pressure on Hamas, as well as the 160,000 Gazans who escaped Gaza and are living in Cairo. The Qataris host the Hamas leadership and have been doing so for years. For years, they can simply tell Hamas, if you don't agree, we are going to tell you you have to leave Qatar. So I think that there is serious leverage that can be applied, but the deal on the table needs to be better than the current one. It really needs to end the war in 4 to 6 weeks, remove the Israeli soldiers from Gaza. There needs to be security arrangements so that smuggling cannot happen across the Gaza-Egypt border, 14 kilometers of road where tunnels were that fueled Hamas and enabled them to build such a strong military machine, though that needs to be sealed. But it doesn't have to be sealed by Israel. And it doesn't have to be sealed on the Gaza side of the border. There's the Egyptian side. The Americans need to come in and say, we will provide finance, technology, and American oversight. There will be American supervisors, inspectors on the ground to make sure that the Egyptians are blocking tunnels across that border. And there are other means that can be met to provide Israel with greater security, but also to ensure that Israel won't attack Gaza again and kill more Palestinians in Gaza.
I want to bring up some of these points. You have laid out in your plan a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza by the end of 6 weeks. You say for every hostage return, Israelis have to agree to release 35 Palestinian prisoners of Israel's choosing. You say the Rafah border crossing can no longer be under the control of Hamas, and it needs to be controlled by a multinational team. I wonder, in Israel, where you are right now, what has been the reaction to these proposals? Because it certainly can't be easy for many Israelis to read this and think, yes, we'd be okay with this.
Yeah, I'm not presenting it for debate in Israel. And the number 35 prisoners per hostage was an arbitrary number that I thought would be sufficient for Hamas. And there are enough prisoners that Israel could release. I also said that within the number of prisoners released, we have to give in to some of Hamas's demands, which are, I believe that I wrote that 50% of the almost 600 prisoners who are serving life sentences for killing Israelis would be released. But as opposed to what happened in 2011 in the Shalit deal, I believe that prisoners should be released to their homes, which are mainly in the West Bank, which provides Israel with the opportunity and the possibility of monitoring them and knowing if they're engaging in terrorism and serving as a threat to Israel. When they were sent to Gaza or deported abroad, Israel had no ability to know what they were doing, and many of them were central actors in the terrorism that took place on October 7th. So we need to think of all kinds of mitigating measures that will provide Israel with greater security, even though there is no deal without releasing a significant number of Palestinian prisoners, and that's something we have to accept as well. My assessment is that Prime Minister Netanyahu will not agree to any deal until they have successfully found and killed Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader in Gaza. I think this is the so-called victory picture that Netanyahu wants in order to be able to make a deal. But Sinwar is probably...
Just for our audience, forgive me, Gershon, but just for our audience, so they're familiar, Yahya Sinwar, the newly appointed head of Hamas, and also the lead architect behind the vicious and brutal attacks of October the 7th. This is the guy that Israelis need to make peace with, apparently, and this is a complicated matter as he's recognized internationally as a terrorist and the head of a terrorist organization. So let me ask you this.
Let me just say, we're not talking about making peace with Yahya Sinwar. We're talking about a ceasefire deal to end this war. There is no peace in the agenda between Israel and Hamas, and that should be understood as well. But there is a peace deal between Israel and the Palestinian people under the leadership of other people, and there are significant, serious Palestinian leaders there who are interested in advancing a two-state solution, ending the Israeli occupation, and living in peace side by side with Israel.
Thank you for that clarification, Gershon, because you did say in your piece that Hamas cannot continue to be in power in a post-war Gaza. But let me ask you now about this great idea on paper. But in reality, Blinken is back on the ground. He's in Tel Aviv. He's going to meet with the leadership tomorrow. Then he's off to Egypt. The talks resume in Egypt tomorrow. But neither one of the two key figures really wants to agree to anything. And in the background of all of this, all of us have been sitting on the edge of our seats about whether Iran is going to launch another series of attacks. So where are we realistically in terms of bringing this war to an end?
Well, I think we have to understand that the Iranian question is another big one on the table, and this should be a further incentive for Israel to reach an agreement now with Hamas that will end the war and bring the hostages home, because the Iranians have let it be known that if a ceasefire is reached, that they will restrain from their a retribution attack against Israel for the believed Israeli assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh on Iranian soil. So I think this is very, very significant. We don't want a regional war. We don't want this war expanding beyond the borders where they are today. We also know from previous experience in last November, when a deal was made on a ceasefire for a week, that Hezbollah stopped shooting rockets at Israel during that period. And Hezbollah has said that if the war in Gaza ends, then their war with Israel will end at this point. And we need a negotiated diplomatic solution to the conflict between Israel and Lebanon as well. We have to understand that there is no military solution to these conflicts. There are political solutions, and that's the direction that we need to head on. But in order to get there, we need new leadership in Israel. We need new leadership in Palestine. We need the Americans, the Qataris, and the Egyptians to use the doomsday leverage tools that they have in their diplomatic toolbox. We need the rest of the world to help us as well to make sure that this is the last Israeli-Palestinian war. We can't keep doing this.
Gershon Baskin, you have been our guide for the past 10 and a half months, and you've done so again today. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thank you.